Hello everybody, this is Dr. Christopher White and today we're moving on to the second half of lecture 17. So we're going to be dealing with more Mesozoic life and we're going to be focusing on the dinosaurs, the marine and flying reptiles, the birds and the evolution of the mammals. Alright, so we'd already done the Ceratopsian dinosaurs in the previous presentation, so now we're on to the second of the subclades of the group Dinosauria, the Ornithischian dinosaurs. Now, we already discussed this bit, so we already discussed there are very minor differences between the Ceratopsian and the Ornithischian dinosaurs. Obviously, the main difference is the pelvis. The Ornithischian dinosaurs have a bird-like pelvis. The Ceratopsian dinosaurs have a lizard-like pelvis. So there are also a couple more minor differences between the two groups. The Ornithischian dinosaurs had no teeth on the front of their mouths. They had beaks, essentially, which replaced the front teeth. Now that's helpful if you are eating plant matter, and if that plant matter is particularly tough, then obviously having a beak is quite useful because you can use it like a pair of shears to snip off small tough branches and small tough leaves. And the other difference is that they had ossified, so that's bone-like tendons in their hind region. As I mentioned in the last presentation, I have absolutely no idea if that's some kind of evolutionary advantage or not. I don't know what's going on there. I'm going to hold my hands up to that one. Okay, so the Ornithischian dinosaurs are split into 5 subgroups. The Ornithopods, the Pachycephalosaurs, the Ankylosaurs, Stegosaurs, and the Ceratopsians. So those are the 5 subgroups of the Ornithischian dinosaurs. Okay, so we've already seen this slide, but we're going to go over it again just to keep everything, in one presentation. So the Ornithopods, they're a group of herbivorous dinosaurs that likely functioned most of the time as bipeds, but had the capacity to move as quadrupeds. And I think I might have mentioned in the previous presentation there are some examples of essentially young and middle-aged ornithopods who are clearly moving on just their hind legs. And then when we find older, more mature examples of ornithopod dinosaurs, we actually see that the amount of wear on the joints of the front limbs is significantly increased. So this would suggest that when they are young and when they're in their middle age, these ornithopod dinosaurs are moving as bipeds. But as they got older, they would start to use their front legs as well. So they would, they'd move from being bipedal to quadrupedal, at least for periods of time. And that's why we get this increase in the amount of wear on in the joints of the front limbs. So the most numerous variety of the ornithopods were a group called the duck-billed dinosaurs, otherwise referred to as the hadrosaurs, and they were very common during the Cretaceous. In fact, it's the rise of these hadrosaurs that actually helped to, to some degree, outcompete the sauropod dinosaurs, the long-necked dinosaurs, and that helped to, to contribute to their downfall. So they were very, very common in the Cretaceous, and many hadrosaurs had crests on the top of their heads, and studies have shown that these crests would have been used like amplifiers and echo chambers. So whenever the dinosaur made a noise, it would have been amplified, made a lot louder, made a lot bolder. And so it's, obviously it's debated about what these noises were used for. Some people think they were used for communication. Some people think they might have been used for selection of mates. Some people have also suggested they could have had a defensive capacity. If you have the capacity to let out a big scary roar, maybe that would scare off a dinosaur that was planning to attack you. Yeah, it might not. Who knows? So one particular hadrosaur, a dinosaur called Mesozoic, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which translates into good mother dinosaur, is very interesting because it built 2-meter wide nests at 7-meter intervals. And 7 meters is about the length of your average Mesozoic. And so this would suggest that it's just that the nests were spaced out in such a way as to ensure that one dinosaur could not crush the eggs of another dinosaur. Now, the interesting thing about Mesozoic is that when we look at the nests, and there are a couple of examples where the nesting sites have been inundated, probably by flash floods. So the nesting site got hit, and so that would have covered over the nests, obviously the mothers protecting the eggs, and any other dinosaurs that were in the area. And when we look at the population of the Mesozoic dinosaurs in these nesting sites that have been, covered over by flash floods, for instance, so that all the animals got trapped, they couldn't run away, so we get a very good snapshot of the population. What we find is that the population consists of adults. It obviously consists of the eggs, and also very, very, very young dinosaurs that have just come out of the eggs. But there's also a group of juvenile dinosaurs up to about 1 meter in length, which are also there. Now that's interesting because that would suggest that Mesozoic is actually taking care of juveniles. So it's not just, the young dinosaurs aren't just coming out of the eggs. Maybe they're taking care of them for a short period of time, then those little dinosaurs are on their own. It would actually seem that Mesozoic is actually taking the time to take care of the juveniles for extended periods of time. Now, that's obviously a good strategy because that's going to improve their chances of survival and therefore, their chances of also then breeding to continue the family line forward, to continue the species as a whole forward. So it would seem that there is a reasonable body of evidence to suggest that at least Mesozoic and probably the group as a whole, the Ornithopod group as a whole, probably took care of their young for extended periods of time. Now, obviously, as I've also touched on, that's significantly different to other reptiles, for instance, turtles, where they will just lay the eggs and off they go. They leave the eggs alone, and the young then have to fend for themselves. So, it's quite an obvious and significant difference. And of course, this is your average ornithopod dinosaur, dominantly bipedal, with the capacity to be quadrupedal if required. The main interesting fact is there's the crest up there, which would be used as an echo chamber, and of course here's the bony beak on the front, which could be used to snip off small pieces of plant matter. Okay, so the next group of dinosaurs are the Pachycephalosaurs. So that's another group of bipedal herbivores, and this group is particularly interesting because it has a very distinct feature which neither group has. On the top of their heads, you can just see it in the picture behind here, they had a very overdeveloped, very thick, dome-shaped skull. Now, the species varied between about 1 and 4.5 meters in length, so they weren't hugely, they weren't massive dinosaurs. And they appear to have only lived on northern hemisphere continents during the Cretaceous. So if you think about the position of the continents during the Cretaceous, so if you remember, during that time, Gondwana has now rifted off Laurasia. So you have essentially two land masses. You have North America, Europe and Asia all joined together. And you have South America, Africa, India, Australia, Antarctica, Madagascar, all moving away as a landmass of their own. By that point, in fact, that landmass, Gondwana, is falling to pieces. So that helps to explain the distribution of the Pachycephalosaurs. So, if they're on, North America, if they're in North America, Europe and Asia, obviously they can't get onto the other continents because they're separated by bodies of water, and obviously these dinosaurs cannot swim. So that explains why they're limited to these northern hemisphere continents. So North America, Europe and Asia were joined together so they could easily move from one continent to another during that time, but they could not make it to the southern hemisphere continents. So why these dinosaurs had this very thick, overdeveloped skull is actually uncertain. So the traditional view is that the Pachycephalosaur males would probably butt heads a bit like modern rams, probably in an attempt to gain dominance within a pack or a herd, and that would most likely have been for mating rights. It's also been suggested that the thick domed skull could be some kind of defensive mechanism, and it could have allowed them to essentially charge predators that were threatening them, or maybe the herd as a whole. So, that is an idea, but obviously, that might work if they were charging at a relatively small dinosaur, but if they're charging at something pretty big like a Tyrannosaurus rex, well, clearly that's a very brave strategy indeed. So, why they have these thick bony skulls is uncertain. Chances are they were probably for butting heads in some kind of mating display. And so we can see this picture here. We can see mostly bipedal, big powerful hind legs. Front limbs were on the whole relatively small, so it couldn't move as a quadruped. We have the bony beak, and we have this very heavily overdeveloped skull. Now, quite a few examples will have, very big lumps or horns on the nose and around the top of this, around the base of this dome here, and that's very important because that's going to hint at a link to another one of the groups of Ornithischian dinosaurs. And here's the group in fact, the Ceratopsians. So the Ceratopsians are the horned dinosaurs. Now, they make their first appearance in the late Jurassic. They were all quadrupeds and they were all herbivores. So the fossil record for this group is very, very good. The reason for that is because the skulls are very big, they're very chunky, and so they preserve very, very well. The bodies of these animals were also very, very big and very, very chunky. That means big, solid bones, which are going to fossilize more readily than thin, more fragile bones. So we have good fossils for the Ceratopsian group. So what we see is the skulls obviously have horns, and they have they show the development of a neck frill. So in terms of the horns, the horns can either be individual, they can occur as simply one horn, or you can have more horns. The classic example of course, a ceratopsian dinosaur is the dinosaur Triceratops, that of course has a nose horn and a horn located over each eye, so it had three horns in total. So the earliest example of the Ceratopsian group is a Chinese species called Yinglong, and it was about 3 meters long, so it also weighed about 65 kilograms, about the same weight as a baby rhinoceros. It was bipedal, so it was not a quadruped, and it possessed few ceratopsian features. However, it does have some features that begin to hint at it being essentially the ancestor dinosaur for the Ceratopsian group. It actually possessed features that were present in the Pachycephalosaurs. So it would seem that Yinglong, if it is essentially the ancestor species for the Ceratopsians, it may also be the ancestor species for the Pachycephalosaurs, and that would suggest that those two groups are quite closely related. So we have numerous Ceratopsian track marks, and we also have the formation of bone beds produced when several individuals die at the same time, and they all indicate that Ceratopsians most likely moved as herds, and those herds probably contain not only adults, but also juveniles and relatively young dinosaurs. So think of a herd a bit like a modern-day elephant herd. So in terms of the bone frill that sits at the back of the skull and protects the neck, there's a few suggestions as to why it could have existed. The first and most obvious suggestion is it's defensive. So obviously having a big heavy bone frill right at the base of the skull helps to protect the neck. It means that dinosaurs like Triceratops could not bite down onto the neck, because obviously once that happens, you're pretty much doomed. So having the neck frill there obviously stops dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus Rex being able to access the neck and essentially biting the neck and killing you very, very quickly. It gives you more of a chance of survival. There have actually been fossils of Ceratopsians that have been found that show that the frill has been damaged and it has healed. And it's been suggested that the damage to the frill could well be due to a attack by a large carnivore. So that would suggest, because we can see the signs of the bone healing, that would obviously suggest that the frill did its job, and the frill protected the neck, and the dinosaur survived the attack. It's also possible that the frill could have been for display purposes, so it could have been for mating purposes. Now, this is suggested because some dinosaurs, the frills are not solid bone. They do in fact have big open spaces in the frill. Now this would mean that the frill would actually be quite light, so that essentially there would be a central strut of bone going up the middle, and there would be an arch of bone going over the top, and the frill itself would mostly have just been a membrane of skin pulled over the top. And dinosaurs that have that kind of frill design, essentially they had very, very big frills. They would look quite imposing. And so it's been suggested that those frills could possibly be more for display purposes than for defensive purposes. So it's possible the frills could have been dual use. Maybe they were defensive and then over time they evolved to become more for display, or maybe they initially started off as features for display and then over time they developed into something more defensive. It's debatable. In terms of the horns of the Ceratopsian dinosaurs, well, they could have been defensive, and I'm sure if you ever had a a dinosaur book when you were a kid, chances are there was a picture in there of a Triceratops battling a Tyrannosaurus Rex or something, and you could see that the horns were being used for defense, and that makes a reasonable amount of sense. However, analysis of the skulls of some Ceratopsian dinosaurs has actually suggested that the horns would actually have been surprisingly brittle. And so there's a realistic possibility that in the event they were actually used for defense, if it was a particularly hard-fought attack, then that could easily lead to the horns snapping off. So that would be that would suggest that maybe they weren't for defensive purposes. So if they're not designed to really be able to survive the kind of impacts that would occur if the dinosaur really was fighting for its life, then maybe they're actually for another use. They could obviously be for display purposes, maybe to just maybe to scare off potential predators, or they could have been for mating purposes. Maybe males with larger horns would have been preferred by Ceratopsian females. Don't really know about that point. And of course, there's the other possibility that has been suggested: they could have been used for competing for mates. Once again, think stags, for instance. Now, on this point, once again, we have the problem that some species appear to have had relatively fragile horns. And so, whether they would have been willing to risk them butting heads like modern day stags do is debatable. So in terms of Yinglong, so here's Yinglong. So it's bipedal. It did have quite long forelimbs, so it might have had the capacity to move as a quadruped if it really wanted. But the main difference is, with Yinglong, we can see the development of the bony beak. But the most important thing is the shape at the base of the skull here. You can start to see this little crest right here at the top. This essentially is the start of the frill that sits at the back of the skull, and that will eventually develop into the kinds of frills we see here, like in this picture of Triceratops. So eventually we evolve in Triceratops. We can see we have this big bony beak here. We have the neck frill, very oversized neck frill, which obviously protects the neck. So it means that dinosaurs cannot bite from the top down. So it means if a Tyrannosaurus Rex tried to bite down, the neck frill would get in the way. And so obviously, it makes a reasonably good defensive structure. And then obviously you had essentially the horns. Most of the Ceratopsian dinosaurs had at least had a nose horn minimum. And quite a few species also had a pair of horns located over the eyes. So then we have the Ankylosaurs, and the Ankylosaurs are a group of quadrupedal herbivores. They were very, very stocky and very, very heavily armored. They had very heavily armored skin, and they are arguably the slowest dinosaur around. They had a top speed of about 10 kilometers an hour, and that's about the same kind of speed that a power walker goes at the Olympics. So they first make their appearance in the Middle Cretaceous, and examples have been found in North America, Europe, and East Asia. So once again, they're limited to the Northern Hemisphere continents only. So the body armor consists of a very, very, very thick, leathery / bony hide, and this covers the head, the back, and the flanks of the Ankylosaurs, so the flanks of the sides, and some species of Ankylosaur also possess a large bony club at the end of the tail. So I'm actually just going to get rid of these, and you can kind of see this design here. So here's the dinosaur itself. You can see it's quadrupedal, very heavily built. We can see that the back is covered in these very large bony spines, and the skin itself would have been very, very hard. We can also see that defense continues down onto the sides, and it also continues onto the top of the head. So these are very, 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 very heavily armored dinosaurs. So obviously would have meant that if any dinosaur attacked them, and they were attacking the top, they would have a very, very difficult time actually succeeding in their attack. So it's been suggested that if a predator failed to be beaten back by the bony club at the end of the tail, it was probable the Ankylosaur would simply just lie down. And this would then, this would mean that essentially, if it lied down and managed to tuck its legs in under itself, well, obviously, the dinosaur that was attacking it could only attack the big, heavy armor. And your average ankylosaur would have weighed somewhere in the region of about 4.5 tons. It would have been about 9 meters long. So a Tyrannosaurus rex would have had a very difficult time flipping one of these things over. So I'm sure we've seen Jurassic Park, or is it Jurassic World, the second movie. During that movie, there's an attack where a Tyrannosaurus rex, a theropod dinosaur, attacks a ankylosaur, and you see that theropod dinosaur just flip over the ankylosaur like it's nothing. That would not be possible. That's 4.5 tons. That's a big, big dinosaur. Flipping it over would be extremely difficult. So ankylosaurs are very, very heavily armored, very, very slow, and they would have been extremely, robust creatures. And you can see in this model here, once again, big, heavy armor on the back, typically with spines of some type, armor over the head, very heavy armor on the sides, often going down onto the limbs, and you have this bony club on the end of the tail. Which obviously, if the dinosaur was attacked, the preferred model is that the ankylosaur would have turned its back on the dinosaur, and it would have used its tail to swat from side to side to try and beat back whatever dinosaur was attacking it. The final one of the Ornithischian dinosaurs is the group Stegosauria. So Stegosauria are a group of quadrupedal herbivores, and they have very, very overdeveloped hind legs. And in fact, as the group develops, the hind legs become so large that the animal would have had difficulty running. Now, we don't know whether the stegosaurs of the group Stegosauria preferred to move in herds or whether they preferred to move individually. We're not sure on that particular point. So the group existed from the late Triassic to the early Cretaceous, and fossils for the last common ancestor, Cripes, a dinosaur that I'm not going to try and pronounce, I'm sorry, the name is right there if you want to have a crack at it, indicates that the stegosaurs and the ankylosaurs are related. And, you can kind of see basic similarities there, both quadrupedal, both have, sets of plates or spines running down the back, and both have tails which end in defensive structures. So, where are we? They're related. Stegosauria fossils are found in North America, Europe, and North Asia. So once again, they were only limited to the northern hemisphere continents, because of course by the time the stegosaurs made their appearance, the southern hemisphere continents had separated off, and they were doing their own thing. So the stegosaurs could never have gotten to them. So, although the most well-known member, Stegosaurus, had bony plates on its back, species within the group, some also had spines or plates. And in terms of the spines along the back, obviously they are very likely for defense. That makes sense. In terms of the species that had plates on the back, like the Stegosaurs, well, the reason for those plates is debatable. Some people suggest the plates could have been used for cooling or heating. So if the dinosaur was running too hot, it could have pumped blood into the plates, and that would have allowed the heat to escape into the surrounding air. Some people have suggested that maybe if the dinosaur was cold, it could have turned to face the plates into the sun. Once again, pumped blood in, and that would have allowed the plates to heat up the blood, and so that would have meant the dinosaur could warm up faster. Some people have suggested that the plates could have been defensive. Unlikely, because they were pretty flimsy, but it's a possibility they could have formed some kind of defensive protection for the animal. And some people have suggested they could have been for display purposes. They might have been brightly coloured, and so they could have been used for attracting mates. We're not really sure what the most likely use for them was. In terms of the tail of the vast majority of stegosaurs terminated in at least 2, usually 4 spikes. And so it was very likely used for defensive purposes. Now, the interesting thing is, when it comes to the stegosaurs, I'm actually going to take away a couple of these, take away a couple of paragraphs here. You can see the hind legs are very, very overdeveloped. And so what this means is essentially the tail end of the stegosaurus being pushed up, so it sits a lot higher than the front limbs. So essentially the Stegosaur's hindquarters would constantly have been up in the air. Now, what this means is it means the tail is also going to be constantly up in the air. Now, that's not a great design feature unless you're worried about big predatory theropod dinosaurs, like Allosaurus, for instance. So this basic design then means that if you're attacked by a big theropod dinosaur, like an Allosaurus, which essentially is slightly smaller than a Tyrannosaurus rex, but not too much smaller, it would have meant that when you swished this tail from side to side, when you swatted it from side to side, it would have meant that as it was moving around, it would have put that tail at about the head and neck height of a large theropod dinosaur. So an Allosaurus would have really had to think carefully about whether it wanted to attack a Stegosaurus, because there's a very good chance it could have gotten one of these spikes through the side of its head. So, in terms of defending itself from small dinosaurs, like the raptors, like, for instance, dinosaurs similar to velociraptors, this kind of design is actually not particularly efficient, because that tail would be pointing up in the air. It would not be able to actually hit those small dinosaurs. But larger dinosaurs, on the other hand, like the larger theropods, this tail design with essentially the hind legs pushing the hindquarters and the tail into the air would have been absolutely perfect, because it would have put this tail at just the right height to hit them in the upper torso, the neck, or the head. So this is the standard Stegosaurian dinosaur design. All of them were quadrupedal. All of them had these very overdeveloped hind legs. Obviously, you had the bony beak. Along the back, you either had spines or plates. As discussed, the spines would have been most likely defensive. The use for the plates is uncertain. And obviously, the tail terminates in at least 2, usually 4 spikes for defensive purposes. Okay, so those are our groups of dinosaurs. Now, something interesting happened in March 2017. So the dinosaur diagram that we have here, which splits dinosaurs into 2 groups, the Saurischian dinosaurs and the Ornithischian dinosaurs, is based on fossils from the late 19th and early 20th century. So this diagram here is based on a relatively limited fossil group of fossils. So you have to bear in mind the fossil record at this point was very, very limited. There weren't a lot of complete skeletons around. And so when the dinosaurs were split up into these groups, well, it was based on the fossils that were available. Now, a recent study has looked at a much larger dinosaur fossil set, and it's focused primarily on the hip bones in particular. And it's produced a significant change to this diagram. So the new data suggests that the theropod dinosaurs are actually part of the clade Ornithischia. So they're actually an Ornithischian dinosaurs rather than a Saurischian dinosaur. So that would put the theropods there. Now, this is quite important. So by including the theropods with the Ornithischian or bird hip dinosaurs, it gets around a big problem, which is of course the evolution of birds. So we are certain that the birds evolved from the theropod dinosaurs. However, if the birds are part of if the theropod dinosaurs are part of the Saurischian group or the lizard-hipped group, that obviously brings about the question of how did they end up with a bird-like pelvis? The most logical argument would be, well, maybe the theropod dinosaurs should be over here with the Ornithischian dinosaurs, and that way, there's not a significant, change in pelvic design required. That would make a lot more sense. So by making the theropods part of the bird hip dinosaur group, it makes the evolution of birds far more straightforward. Some problems do exist, however, and there's a couple of them. And the first one is that all of the Ornithischian dinosaurs were herbivores, and all of them had beaked mouths. So this means that the theropod group, if they are part of the Ornithischian line, have to have separated early before these dinosaurs up here, before these 5 groups up here really became very strongly established. So it meant that theropods had to separate off before the dinosaurs in the Ornithischian line began to become very specialized plant eaters. So, that was just if the theropods are going to be part of this line, they have to have branched off right down here, right at the start. So it does, however, bring about another issue. If the theropods are moving from here to here, well, that leaves the poor old sauropods all by themselves. Now, at this point, we then have an interesting situation, because that would maybe suggest that the sauropods could no longer be considered dinosaurs, and as such, they would have to be considered a clade all in their own right. So the arguments on this point have already started and will probably go on for several more decades. Okay, so we've been going for half an hour actually, so this is a great time to pause for a break. So pause the presentation, get up, have a walk around, go and get a glass of water, and come back in a few minutes, please. Okay, everybody. So one of the questions that's begun to become more common recently is, were dinosaurs warm or cold-blooded? Now, the obvious answer is, well, they're reptiles. They've got to be cold-blooded. However, there's a body of evidence that's starting to build up now that would suggest that dinosaurs were actually, or at least some dinosaurs, were endotherms, so that's a warm-blooded organism, rather than an ectotherm, which is a cold-blooded organism. So the body of evidence has begun to suggest that, as I say, some dinosaurs may have actually been endotherms. So this data that's been collected can actually be interpreted in one of four broad ways. If you interpret the data as to suggest that it means the dinosaurs are warm-blooded, well, that might suggest that all dinosaurs were warm-blooded. The data could also be used to suggest that just some dinosaurs were warm-blooded. The data could suggest that maybe dinosaurs had the capacity to regulate metabolism change with age. So maybe young dinosaurs started off as endothermic, so they could grow very, very quickly, but as they got older and bigger, they would become ectothermic. So some people have suggested it could be some kind of change due to age. And the other possibility is, of course, the data has been interpreted incorrectly and that all dinosaurs were actually cold-blooded. Alright, so now we're going to go through the evidence. Okay, so the first bit of evidence is the bones. So endothermic dinosaurs, so warm-blooded dinosaurs, have numerous passageways within their bones which are filled with blood vessels when the animal is alive. The ectotherms, the cold-blooded dinosaurs, also have these passageways, but they are present in much lower density. So being warm-blooded dinosaurs obviously have a much higher metabolism. That means there is a much greater requirement for oxygen. So the cells in our body burn oxygen a lot faster than the cells in a ectotherm's body. So our bodies have to have lots and lots of oxygen. Now this means obviously in order to keep the cells in your bone marrow alive, you obviously need to get lots and lots of oxygen to them, and you do that obviously using your blood. And so there have to be lots and lots of holes in warm-blooded animal bone to let those blood vessels into the bone so the oxygen can get to the cells of the bone marrow. So this essentially explains why warm-blooded animals have to have so many essentially passageways in the bone to allow the blood vessels into it to keep the cells inside the bone alive. So in the case of ectotherms, because they have a lower metabolism, they do not require, there's not such a requirement to get oxygen to the cells inside the bone quite as quickly, and so they require fewer blood vessels. So this means that when we look at the blood vessel density for endotherms, it's normally high, and for ectotherms, it's comparatively lower. When we look at dinosaur bones, we see that dinosaur bones had a high blood vessel density, similar to modern endotherms. So great, that's it, job done, we can all go home. The answer is, of course, no. So the problem is that some reptiles, like crocodiles and turtles, have bones that appear to be endothermic, even though we know that those animals are in fact ectothermic, they're cold-blooded. On the other hand, some small mammals, obviously warm-blooded, actually have bones that appear to be ectothermic, so they appear to be cold-blooded. So the blood vessel density, the density of these holes in the bone, is not a definitive indicator, so you have to interpret the data carefully. You can't just use it on its own to suggest that some dinosaurs might have been warm-blooded. You have to use it in conjunction with several other pieces of evidence. Okay, but is there anything else the bones can tell us? Well, the answer is yes. Bones also have growth lines. So the growth lines are just like tree rings. So as any organism essentially grows, as it goes from being a baby to a fully formed adult, essentially it will be adding mass to its bones day after day, week after week, year after year as the animal gets bigger. And we see the development and growth of these bones as growth lines within the bones, as I say, just like rings within a tree. So what we can do is we can look at these growth lines in the bones, and they can help us to indicate, how quickly or slowly was the dinosaur growing. In terms of the growth lines, they're like tree rings. You get thin, dark growth lines which occur in the winter when bone growth was slower or pauses, obviously due to lower food levels. And you get broader, lighter lines which occur in the spring and summer when bone growth was more rapid because there was typically more food around. So the theory is that although reptile and mammal bone have growth lines in their... Sorry, let's try that sentence again. The theory is that although reptiles and mammals both have growth lines in their bones, the thickness, especially of the blood-rich areas, varies. So what we're trying to say is that warm-blooded animals will typically have big, thick growth rings, and cold-blooded animals will typically have much thinner growth rings. And it's all to do with the metabolism. How quickly can you take the food that you ingest and turn it into energy to do stuff? Now, in the case of a warm-blooded organism, so an endotherm, obviously that food that's taken in is very quickly broken down, and it's very quickly used to produce energy, and that energy is very quickly put into, is very quickly used to help the juvenile animal grow, to help it get bigger. And so that's why essentially the growth lines get very, very thick, because these organisms are taking in lots and lots of material. They're turning it into energy very, very quickly, and so that energy results in nice, big, thick growth lines. In contrast, cold-blooded animals like reptiles typically have much lower metabolisms, and so it takes longer for them to turn the food that they consume into energy, and typically because they consume less food, typically that food, the energy that's liberated from that food has to be used for a lot of different uses, so it's spread a little bit thinner. And so this means that the bone growth rates for reptiles is on the whole slower, and so the growth zones within the bones are often a lot thinner. So when we look at dinosaur growth zones, this is actually a Tyrannosaurus rex here, we can see the bands are nice and big and thick. Just like in this piece of deer bone here, we can see this piece of deer bone has these nice, big, thick bands in it. So that would suggest that dinosaurs might have been warm-blooded. Now, obviously, the thing you need to remember is, obviously, once the animal stops growing, the development of these growth zones stops. So this leads back to the suggestion that maybe dinosaurs had the capacity to be warm-blooded when they were young, so they could grow very, very quickly, hence the big, thick growth lines, and then maybe later on they became ectothermic once they achieved adulthood. So that's where that suggestion comes from. Okay, so what other piece of evidence do we have? Well, the next piece of evidence is percentage of the population. So as endothermic predators, so warm-blooded predators, think lions, tigers, etc., burn so much energy they need to eat a lot. So big predators like a lion has to eat at least every other day, otherwise it's in trouble. So in order to do this, obviously, large predators need lots of animals to eat. So they need to have a very, very big population of prey. So that means for every one warm-blooded predator, you require, let's say maybe 100, 200, possible animals that it could maybe try and eat. So, there's a very, very big disparity. You'll have a very, very big population of prey animals, and you'll have only a few predators. In contrast, ectothermic, so cold-blooded predators, burn energy more slowly, so they require less food, and that means you can have a lot more of them in a relatively confined space because they're not competing for food so much. So if you've ever been to anywhere that has alligators or crocodiles, Florida would be a good example, you will know that when you're in those areas, the density of alligators is actually extremely high. So, you'll look in the water and you'll see there are lots of them around. And that's because they're cold-blooded, they essentially can survive on less food, which means there's less competition for food, which means you can squeeze more of them into a smaller area. In contrast, groups of predators like lions require huge areas of land and large quantities of prey in order to be able to feed themselves and survive. So this means that endothermic predators can make warm-blooded predators make up only a few % of the total population of animals in a given area. In contrast, ectothermic or cold-blooded predators make up to 50% of the total population in an area because they simply require less food, so there can be more of them. Now, in the areas where we have good dinosaur population data, it would seem that the predators make up only about 3 to 5% of the total population, which would suggest that you had a very, very high quantity of prey animals and only a very limited number of carnivores. That suggests a high metabolism and possibly being warm-blooded. However, once again, there are uncertainties There are uncertainties about this data, because obviously we only have this kind of population data from a few places, so that, it's very limited in its scope. And also, we can't be certain that the population data we have is actually representative. It could be that we think it's representative, but in reality it's not representative at all. So yes, the data suggests that based on the percentage of the population that the predators make up, it would suggest that they could have been warm-blooded. However, once again, we have to use this data very carefully. Okay, so the next piece of evidence is the brain size. So a large brain compared to body size requires a constant body temperature. So endotherms tend to have larger brains for their body size. Another problem is that brains use up significant amounts of energy. So the human brain is only 2% of our body mass. However, it uses up 20% of the body's energy budget. So a brain is amazingly energy hungry. So if you want to keep your brain going, essentially if you want a big brain, the best conditions are you have to be able to keep it at a stable temperature, and you have to be able to provide it with absolutely bundles of energy. And in that case, it becomes relatively clear why, on the whole, warm-blooded animals have larger brains than cold-blooded animals. Simply because warm-blooded animals maintain a constant body temperature, and because we have our high rate of metabolism, we can take food that we ingest, turn it into energy, which can be given to the brain very, very quickly. So typically, big brain equals warm-blooded. In contrast, cold-blooded animals tend to have noticeably smaller brains. So what do we see when we look at dinosaurs? When we look at the dinosaurs, we notice that these small to medium theropod dinosaurs, those are the meat-eating dinosaurs, had a very high brain to body size ratio. They had really big brains. So that's another piece of evidence that suggests that maybe they are warm-blooded. Another thing is that these small to medium theropod dinosaurs are strongly related to birds. They are the group of dinosaurs from which birds evolved. And birds are, of course, warm-blooded, also covered in feathers. So that would suggest that maybe because birds are warm-blooded, that's a reasonable hint that maybe these small to medium theropod dinosaurs could have been warm-blooded. So next we have the growth rate. Now this actually goes back to the growth lines. So when we look at the bones of duck-billed dinosaurs, we see that the growth rates were extremely high. They grew very, very quickly. Once again, that is suggestive of them having been warm-blooded. When you're warm-blooded, you can take food, turn it into energy, and use that energy to grow very, very quickly. In contrast, Cold-blooded animals take a lot longer to liberate that energy, and so they don't grow as fast. So animals that tend to, so in contrast, when you compare warm-blooded animals and cold-blooded animals, warm-blooded animals will tend to grow considerably faster. And the evidence from the bones of some of these ornithopod dinosaurs suggests that when they were growing extremely quickly. The final piece of evidence is a heart. So in 1993, a fossilized duck-billed dinosaur was found, so that's an ornithopod, and it was actually found to have a fully intact fossilized heart, which is to begin with, pretty spectacular, pretty amazing. So when we look at the heart that is fossilized, we find that it has 4 chambers, like our heart. So mammals and birds have 4 chambers. Reptiles and amphibians have 3 chambers in their heart. So that is very strong evidence to suggest that, at least this particular duck-billed dinosaur may well have been warm-blooded. So I wish to point out, by the way, there has actually been some data recently that has questioned this analysis, but for the time being, this data is still considered to be correct. So based on the evidence, the arguments suggest that maybe the theropods and the ornithopod dinosaurs could have been warm-blooded. And there's reasonable evidence to suggest they were. No piece of evidence on its own is definitive. However, when you add them all together, it makes a strong case to suggest that they could have been warm-blooded. In contrast, some dinosaurs like the sauropods, we are nearly 100% certain they were cold-blooded. So the interesting thing is about the sauropods is that because they were so large, it meant they probably generated their own heat just due to their size. And that process of producing your own heat due to your size is called gigantothermism. So bear this in mind. Some dinosaurs appear to have good evidence to support them being warm-blooded. Some dinosaurs, like the sauropods, have good evidence to suggest that they were in fact cold-blooded. Okay, this is a great place to stop, so let's pause here. So get up, have a walk around, go and get a glass of water, and come back in a few minutes, please. Okay, everyone. So now we're going to move on to the flying reptiles. Now, I just want to make this point again, just to make sure it's very, very clear to everybody. There is no such thing as a flying dinosaur. There is no such thing as a marine dinosaur. There are flying reptiles and there are marine reptiles, but they are completely different branches. They are not part of the dinosaur family. So these flying reptiles are, I repeat one more time, not dinosaurs. So the pterosaurs, that's a silent P, were the first land vertebrates to achieve flight. Obviously, they weren't the first animals to achieve flight. The insects had gotten there in the Paleozoic. So they were common in the skies between the late Triassic and the late Cretaceous. So they were a real success story of the Mesozoic. They made it nearly all the way through. So the pterosaurs had 3 major adaptations which helped them to fly. The first one was that their bones were hollow. Like most modern birds, in order to save weight, the bones become hollow. That means obviously they're lighter, so that makes it easier for the bird to get into the air. Or in this case, the flying reptile. We also see that these reptiles had large regions of the brain that help to control muscle coordination and sight. Well, the muscle coordination part is quite important, obviously, because in order to fly, you need to be able to coordinate your muscles quite effectively. If you are not coordinating your muscles well, you are going to plummet from the sky, and that's going to end badly. In terms of sight, well, that one's pretty obvious as well. If you're flying through the air and you're scanning around to try and find prey on the ground, obviously you need to be able to see it. If you can't see it, you can't hunt it, and if you can't hunt it, you can't catch it, and you're going to starve. The third adaptation is that they have an elongated forefinger that supported the flight membrane. So if we look at this mock-up of a skeleton here, you can see the forefinger is very, very overdeveloped. And what this means is the wing membrane stretches from the tip of the forefinger over here all the way over to the body. So essentially it meets the body over here. So that creates a really big, rigid wing, which can be used for flight. So the evolutionary history for the pterosaurs is particularly bad. So we know they're descended from the Archosaurs, so obviously that's essentially the same ancestor that gave rise to the dinosaurs, the crocodiles, the turtles, etc. But the exact path to get to the pterosaurs is quite uncertain. And the reason for that is, of course, number one, the reasons for that are, number one, the bones are hollow. They're weak, they're fragile, they do not fossilize well. The other situation is that they would tend to live in areas where fossilization is not likely to occur. So chances are they tended to live in, higher terrain areas, which obviously they could access because they can fly. But high terrain areas like mountains tend to actually be quite areas that tend to have quite low rates of sedimentation. So that means that, if the animal does die, its carcass will typically not get buried relatively quickly, and so it will have time to lay there on the surface, and it can be broken up by either scavenging or simply the action of the weather and decomposition. Anyway, so here are some fun facts about flying reptiles. Number one, they are not the ancestors of birds. Number two, most were no larger than sparrows. So if you've seen the movie Jurassic World, you will have actually, seen lots and lots of pterosaurs in that movie, where essentially they have, huge wings. They, lots of really, really big ones. However, the vast majority of them were tiny. They're about the same size as sparrows, robins, probably about as large as a crow. So the largest example was actually pretty big, and it had a wingspan of 12 meters. So don't get me wrong, there were big examples of pterosaurs out there. However, the vast majority of them were small. So the bones of the larger pterosaurs were actually too weak for flapping. So, we have this idea of these big, massive pterosaurs flying through the sky, flapping their wings to keep themselves up in the air, and we actually know that that is not correct. The wings would have been so large and so heavy that if they did try and flap them, the bones of the wing would have snapped. And obviously when that happens, they're doomed. So what we now know is that the very large pterosaurs, like this one that had the 12-meter wingspan, they would have actually functioned more like an albatross, which is a very big bird. So what they would have done is they would have spent most of their time gliding, and they would have used thermals to actually get higher in the atmosphere. So a thermal is an area of the atmosphere where warm air is rising. And so as that warm air rises, what would happen is the pterosaurs would essentially get into that column of warm air, and it would help to carry them up higher into the atmosphere, just like modern albatrosses do. Smaller pterosaurs, on the other hand, probably did have the capacity to flap their wings. So if you go to this link here, it's a link on a YouTube video that shows you a portion of the movie Jurassic World, and you'll notice that in this portion of the movie you'll see both the small pterosaur dinosaurs. Let's say that again. Pterosaurs were not dinosaurs. Ignore what I just said there. You'll see small pterosaurs that are flapping their wings, but you'll also see large pterosaurs that are flapping their wings. And these large pterosaurs flapping their wings, that's not right. Okay, so you now have the knowledge to know that that is incorrect. From what we know, we believe that the pterosaurs laid soft-shelled eggs a bit like turtles. They didn't actually lay hard eggs. Now, why that's the case, we are not completely sure. So, a little bit uncertain about that one. So, we have at least one example where we can see that there is a coat of hair, or at least hair-like feathers, on the skin of the pterosaur. Now, these were probably likely for temperature control. However, whether it is hair, whether it's hair-like feathers is a bit uncertain, but nevertheless it would suggest that, they weren't bald, they had some kind of covering on their bodies that probably did help them to retain heat. Obviously, because if you're flying through the atmosphere, it can actually be surprisingly cold. You'll know if even in warm areas like, Nevada, if you climb a particularly large hill / small mountain in Nevada, you'll know as you get higher in the atmosphere, it can actually get quite chilly, even if the climate in general is quite warm. So if you're flying around in the air, it can actually be quite cold, even in very, very warm climates. So having a layer of hair or a layer of feathers would have obviously been particularly advantageous. There's also a body of evidence that would suggest that given the high energy requirements for flying reptiles, there's a reasonable chance that they were warm-blooded. And we do have some evidence to back that up. It's not particularly strong, but that once again, just like the dinosaurs, there is a body of circumstantial evidence that when you combine it together can be used to make the case to suggest that they may have been warm-blooded. Okay, so on to the Mesozoic marine reptiles. So there are several types of Mesozoic reptiles adapted to the marine environment. So, for instance, crocodiles and turtles are the examples we can obviously think of pretty quickly. In terms of the Mesozoic itself, there were three groups of reptiles that became particularly specialized in the Mesozoic and are pretty synonymous with Mesozoic marine reptiles. So those groups are the Ichthyosaurs, the Plesiosaurs, and the Mosasaurs. So the Ichthyosaurs varied in length from about 0.7 to 15 meters long, so some of them were extremely large, and they had a body morphology similar to a modern shark. So if you remember the term convergent evolution, that's when you get the same body design turning up again and again and again, often in very distantly related species. It keeps reappearing because that body design works so well. So ichthyosaurs have this body design that's very similar to modern-day sharks or modern-day dolphins. So the early stages of ichthyosaur evolution are uncertain. However, we have the species Eutosaurus, and that does fill the gap to some degree. And you can see a picture of one back here, just behind there in green, with its more hand-like flippers and reptile-like tail. So what we can see is, if you go to the pictures, the top one is a standard ichthyosaur. You can see it has a tail for propulsion, fins for steering, and it has this long pointed face. Very, very large eyes for hunting prey, often in the deep, darker waters of the ocean. We believe they mostly ate animals like squid, which tend to live in dark water, deep, dark water. So they would have had to have very, very large eyes in order to be able to see in those kind of depths. In contrast, these very, very early ichthyosaurs, or the ichthyosaurs ancestor species, well, for the fossils we have, we can see the development of the fins, we can see the elongation of the face, and we can see the development of the upper fluke of the tail beginning to occur over time. This will become larger, and eventually you'll end up with this nice symmetrical tail that you see here. So when you actually look at an ichthyosaur, they are remarkably similar in their body design to modern dolphins. The only real difference in terms of body design is that ichthyosaurs move their tail from side to side to propel themselves through the water. Dolphins move their tail up and down. And apart from that, the design itself is remarkably similar. So a wonderful case of convergent evolution. So ichthyosaurs will have used their tails for momentum and their fins for steering, just like modern-day sharks or modern-day dolphins. And from what we can see, their diet consisted mostly of fish and cephalopods. That's animals like squid and octopi. So we know obviously that ichthyosaurs could not leave the water, and obviously being reptiles, well, from what we know about reptiles like to lay eggs. But if you can't leave the water, then that obviously brings about the question of, well, how did they breed? And it would seem that ichthyosaurs had the capacity to give birth to live young. So it would seem that the eggs were retained inside the body, and the young were produced essentially. It would then seem that the mother gave birth to the young. And this is actually supported by fossil evidence, which we're going to see in the next slide. So in fact, let's go and look at it now. Let's skip through this, and we'll come back to the plesiosaurs in just a second. So here we go. So here is an ichthyosaur skeleton. So you can see long head there. You can see these front flippers here. The back flippers there. You can see here's the tail with the kink for the lower fluke. The upper fluke would have been supported by cartilage up here. And you can see right there, you have a small, perfectly formed ichthyosaur. So it would seem that this particular species of ichthyosaur, called Heosaurus, it was found in China in 1974. and you can see that this particular example is in the process of giving birth to a baby ichthyosaur. Now, obviously, the first possibility is that maybe it ate the baby ichthyosaur. Well, we know that it didn't eat the baby ichthyosaur for a couple of reasons. Number one, the baby ichthyosaur's skeleton is complete. It's fully articulated. There are no signs of the ichthyosaur skeleton having been chewed. So there's no teeth marks, which would suggest it had been, caught by the ichthyosaur and then swallowed. And the final piece of evidence that suggests that it's not been eaten by the large ichthyosaur is that the ichthyosaur's stomach would have been down here, about there. So the position of this small ichthyosaur is completely incorrect for it having been eaten by the larger ichthyosaur. So this would suggest that it's actually in the process of giving birth, and unfortunately something clearly went wrong, and the ichthyosaur and the baby both went and died. We also have additional fossils. So here's the same organism again, but in this case what you're looking at is, so this is the back of the rib cage, so it's going to be approximately up here. This is the spinal column, so the vertebrae are visible here. You can kind of see it would be about this area here on this particular skeleton. And you can see one of the rear flippers here, so those are essentially what would be the toes of the rear fin. And if you look carefully here, you can see another fully formed baby ichthyosaur. Now, if you actually look at this diagram down here, you can actually see that there are several baby ichthyosaurs in here, and you can see they're actually color-coded. So here we have one skeleton in yellow, which is this skeleton here. We actually have a skull here in orange, which is difficult to see, but it's right there. And then we have red bones here that are essentially parts of the neck and tail of another baby ichthyosaur. So it would seem that within this mother's womb, there were actually 3 baby ichthyosaurs. So once again, where are those ichthyosaurs located? They are located right here, essentially underneath the spine at the back of the rib cage, exactly where you would expect the uterus to be. So so we have very, very good evidence to suggest that ichthyosaurs gave birth to live young. So what about the plesiosaurs? Well, the plesiosaurs are these long-necked marine reptiles. So plesiosaurs had 2 subgroups. There are long-necked plesiosaurs and short-necked plesiosaurs. So the long-necked plesiosaurs were likely nectonic, and they probably used their long necks to lunge at their prey. A bit like a snake. When a snake's going to attack something, it lunges at it. Chances are these long-necked ichthyosaurs would have done the same thing. They would have just been swimming along, would have spotted something, and they would have just lunged and tried to grab it. So the long-necked plesiosaurs, I do apologize, the long-necked plesiosaurs were nectonic, so they swam around in the water column, and they would have eaten things mostly like fish, cephalopods, that's the squid again. In terms of the short-necked plesiosaurs, they were very likely bottom feeders, so they probably stayed mostly towards the bottom of the seafloor. And from what we can see, their diet mostly consisted of mollusks, echinoderms, that's sea urchins, fish, and cephalopods. So these 2 organisms, mollusks and echinoderms, well, they are mostly associated with the seafloor, the seabed. So that's good evidence to suggest that these short-necked plesiosaurs may well have essentially liked to get their food off the seabed. Hence the shorter neck. If they're just picking stuff up off the seabed, they don't need to be lunging all the time. So in terms of their size, the plesiosaurs were actually quite modest, about 3.5 to 6 meters in size. However, one species managed to make it to 15 meters. So there were, once again, some larger examples, but on the whole, they were relatively conservative. Like ichthyosaurs, we have good evidence to suggest that plesiosaurs gave birth to live young. And we have one example of a plesiosaur which actually contains a fossilized fetus. In terms of the plesiosaurs, they propelled themselves through the water using these paddle-like fins, and also, probably to some degree, using their tail. So this plesiosaur skeleton here isn't quite as easy to decipher, but when you actually focus on it, you actually can see everything's there. Now, to be clear, the skull and this portion of the neck here, which is marked out in this diagram here in white, they are reconstructed. They're not original. The original fossil is actually just the forelimbs, the hind limbs, and the torso. Okay, so it's all the stuff here marked out in brown. So what we have here is we have the embryo skeleton. To begin with, shows no sign of chewing and no sign of digestion by stomach acid. So before we even go any further, it seems highly unlikely that the bones that we see of this very, very young plesiosaur are there because they were eaten by an adult plesiosaur. Okay, the evidence we have strongly suggests that the bones of this juvenile plesiosaur were in fact within the mother, i.e. the mother was pregnant. So there are also several pieces of skeleton located near the mother's shoulder blades in the correct position for the embryo. Okay, so here are the shoulder blades of the mother, right there. And you can see here we have these dark brown patches, mostly located in this area here. And then we have a selection of bones down here, also picked out in dark brown there. These are the bones of essentially the juvenile plesiosaur, which would have been contained within the mother. So in terms of their location, once again, they are located at the back of the rib cage, underneath the spine, in exactly the same position as the ichthyosaur fossils are located. Ichthyosaur babies are located, which would suggest that they are in the correct position for the likely location of the plesiosaur womb. So that, obviously makes a lot of sense. And it would seem that, as I said, there's no signs of chewing, no signs of digestion by stomach acid. So that would suggest that the baby has not been eaten. It is actually inside the mother. Now, in terms of the skeleton, in this case, you can see the skeleton is very badly disarticulated. It's in lots and lots of pieces. So in this case, the disarticulation is likely the result of the partial decomposition of the embryo and the mother. So as the mother's carcass decomposed, chances are eventually the carcass ruptured, and that allowed the partially decomposed body of the baby plesiosaur to essentially fall out onto the seafloor, at which point it decomposed and it essentially led to the disarticulation of the baby fossil. So that's why it's in so many pieces. Now, obviously, if you saw something like that, you would naturally assume, well, the fossil may have been chewed, maybe the fossil's been eaten, and that's why it's in so many pieces. Now, as far as we can see, it's actually due to the process of decomposition after the mother went and died. So, the final group of marine reptiles are the mosasaurs. Now, there was a niche left by the extinction of the ichthyosaurs in the Middle Cretaceous. So by the time making it to the Middle Cretaceous, the ichthyosaurs are actually on the way out. At the same time, the plesiosaurs are also decreasing significantly in their abundance. So there's an opening for a new apex marine predator. And this opening was filled by the mosasaurs. So if you've seen the movie Jurassic World, you'll know the mosasaur is the giant marine reptile in the giant tank. So if you go to this YouTube link here, you will see a quick clip from Jurassic World showing you the mosasaur from that movie swimming around. It's actually a very, very good representation of a mosasaur. In terms of the general body design, the way it moves through the water, it's actually surprisingly accurate. The one inaccuracy is that it's far too big. That's the one problem with it. But on the whole, if you ignore that, everything else is actually surprisingly good. So in terms of mosasaurs, we actually know they're related to modern-day monitor lizards, so that's one of the largest reptiles around, and they will have varied in size between about 2.5 and 9 meters. So they weren't as big as the ichthyosaurs or the plesiosaurs, but they could reach 9 meters. They're still pretty large. In terms of their tail, the tails of the mosasaurs had not managed to separate into the kind of the twin tail that we get with organisms like dolphins, sharks, and the ichthyosaurs. You can see by the time the mosasaurs were developing, you can see we have obviously the vertebrae coming down here. You can see the vertebrae running down into the tail there. And you can see essentially you've built up these two flaps of skin either side of the tail, essentially making a big paddle, which the mosasaur could use to propel itself through the water. We can also see that the front and hind fins of the mosasaur are not hugely well developed yet for moving through the water. you can see in this picture is actually quite clear. You can kind of see hints at the digits. So, you know, the fin itself hasn't become a relatively nice, big, solid appendage. So it's still weaker than it would probably want to be. And in terms of the head design, you can see, yes, the skull is beginning to become elongate. However, it hasn't quite reached the same degree of elongation you get in marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. So what you have here is you have an organism that is on its way to becoming evolved enough to successfully live in the marine environment. However, it didn't actually manage to achieve that because obviously at the end of the Cretaceous, there's the Cretaceous-Tertiary mass extinction, and that pretty much did for the mosasaurs. In terms of the mosasaurs, when the samples we have, when we look at the stomach contents, we see they ate fish, birds, cephalopods, once again squid and octopi, and other small mosasaurs. So mosasaurs were not against cannibalism. We do, however, have one example of mosasaur that contains 4 embryos, suggesting that mosasaurs, just like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, gave birth to live young in the water. And so there's a mosasaur there. I would strongly advise you to go and look at the video on YouTube because it gives you a very good idea of how this animal would have been able to propel itself through the water. It's a very good representation of what they would have looked like. Okay, so you know what? Before we go on to the birds, let's pause here for a few minutes. So pause the presentation, get up, have a walk around, go and get a glass of water, and please come back in a couple of minutes. Okay, everybody, so before we go any further, let's do the code word for today's presentation. The code word for today's presentation is going to be Triceratops. I repeat, Triceratops. So, as more and more feathered dinosaurs are discovered, the boundary between dinosaurs and birds has become more complex. Obviously, the more feathered dinosaurs we have, the more difficult it is to pick out the exact path that evolution took to get from dinosaurs to birds. Makes sense. So, although birds do not resemble dinosaurs, all the evidence suggests that they evolved from a group of small, maybe to medium-sized theropods. So, key similarities are that birds lay amniote eggs, just like dinosaurs did. And there are similarities in the way that the jaws of birds and dinosaurs join the skull. So there's a lot of similarity in the general jaw design. So here's a reptilian jaw, and here's an avian or a bird jaw. And you can see essentially the same basic bones are located in both jaws. Now, if you were to compare that to a mammalian jaw, on the other hand, you would see a mammalian jaw is considerably different. You'll see a mammalian jaw is mostly made up of this kind of like purpley blue area here, which is called the dentary. All these other smaller bones here are either not present anymore, or they are considerably smaller. So the similarities between the reptilian jaw and the avian jaw is very noticeable, or are very noticeable, should I say. So in 1860, a fossil of a bird-like bird/dinosaur was found in Germany, and it was called Archaeopteryx. So this Archaeopteryx fossil had several bird-like features, including feathers, which is obviously a very important one, and a fused clavicle, otherwise known as the wishbone. A clavicle is what we would call a collarbone. So here actually is, this isn't actually the original Archaeopteryx fossil. This is, the original Archaeopteryx fossil is actually in the British Museum in London. This is one that was found slightly later, but you can see quite clearly. So here are the forelimbs. So one limb there, one limb here, head there, neck coming down here, spinal column coming down here, going into a tail, one hind limb, 2 hind limbs. So you can see it looks very similar to a small theropod dinosaur. So what we have is this dinosaur had teeth, it had claws, it had a tail. And when you look at that, it looks like a dinosaur. However, you can see it also had feathers. You can see the feathers on the tail here, and you can see the feathers on the wings coming off like that. So it clearly had feathers. And when we look at the collarbone located here, we can see it's fused, just like the collarbone. So if you eat roast chicken and you pull out the wishbone, that's essentially a fused clavicle. And that's something that birds have. and we see the development of the fused clavicle in these small theropod dinosaurs during the Mesozoic. So Archaeopteryx was classified as a bird, and it was thought to represent the intermediate form between the theropod dinosaurs and the birds. So this idea that dinosaurs and birds are related is actually very, very old. It's become far more common in the past few decades, but in reality, it actually began to make its appearance all the way back in the very late 19th century. So those who oppose calling Archaeopteryx a bird point out that the fused wishbone and the feathers are no longer exclusive to birds, because we know there are now a large number of feathered dinosaurs that also had feathers and fused clavicles. Therefore, when we actually look at this Archaeopteryx, when it really comes down to it, is it really a bird or is it more dinosaur? So there's a very good argument to be made that it's actually a feathered dinosaur rather than a dinosaur-like bird. So there is quite a lot of argument there. Also, the fossil itself comes from late Jurassic rocks, but the theropods only really established themselves as a group in the Cretaceous. So we didn't really see the rise of the theropods until the very early Cretaceous. So there's a bit of a problem there. If these birds are appearing in the late Jurassic, and we're saying, well, they evolved from theropods, but the theropods didn't really appear until the Cretaceous, then obviously you have a chicken and egg situation. However, recently a feathered theropod fossil was found in late Jurassic rocks in China, and there are also two other Archaeopteryx-like birds that have also been found in China that occurred in even older rocks. So that's helped to push back the beginning of the theropod subclade a little bit further, which is exactly what we need to make this make sense. Okay, so during the late Carboniferous and into the Permian, if you remember, we had a group of reptiles which were called the therapsids, and they evolved from the finback reptiles, which you remember were called the Pachycephalosaurs. So among the therapsids, so remember these are mammalian-like reptiles, one group called the cycadonts became the most mammal-like, and they are eventually going to give rise to the mammals. So typically it's actually surprisingly easy to classify a mammal. Mammals are warm-blooded, we have mammary glands, we give birth to live young, we have fur, and we also have differentiated teeth and a free-boned inner ear, which I didn't list on there, which I really should have done. My mistake, I apologise. However, when you just have the skeleton, things become a little bit more complex. So instead, we need to look at features which only occur within the hard portions of the body. That is, the fact that mammals have a free-boned inner ear. In the inner ear, reptiles only have one bone. The jawbone arrangement for reptiles and mammals is totally different. And mammals have clearly differentiated teeth, so we have incisors, canines, and molars. So this is a picture showing you a generic cynodont, and you can quite clearly see most of them, as far as we can work out, are quadrupedal. We believe they had fur, and we can begin to see differentiation of the teeth. For instance, in this picture here, you can quite clearly see canines. So in terms of the jaw design, what's different? Well, if you look at this picture here, this is the one we saw earlier. So this is comparing reptiles to birds. And you can see quite clearly, although the size of the bones varies somewhat, the same bones appear in both reptilian and avian jaws. Now let's step over here and let's look at the mammalian jaw over here. So in this case, the dentary, which over here is blue, is marked out in this kind of peach colour. And you can see quite clearly, in mammalian jaws, it's nearly everything. So nearly the mammalian lower jaw is nearly completely the dentary. Essentially the squamosal, which essentially is marked out, where are we? It's not actually marked out on these diagrams here. Essentially the squamosal, which is not marked out here, there it is, essentially is relatively small here on reptilian jaws, and it's still relatively small on mammalian jaws. The angular bone in most mammalian jaws is very, very small. And so, in contrast, you can see the angular bone in both the reptilian jaw and the avian jaw is still quite large. So we can see there are significant similarities between these two jaws, but these two jaws are significantly different when compared to the mammalian jaw. So that's a good piece of evidence that suggests that birds are not mammals, or at least not related to mammals. They are more closely related to reptiles. Also, one of the other differences we look for is in the ear bones. So in the case of the ear bones, your average reptile will only have a single bone that connects the eardrum to the inner ear. Now, only having one bone that connects the eardrum to the inner ear means that their hearing is not particularly good. In contrast, the mammalian ear consists of, there's the eardrum, here's the inner ear, and you can see there's actually 3 bones there. Having these 3 bones allows the mammalian ear to essentially amplify the sound. So we have considerably better hearing than the reptiles. So another thing you'll notice is that when we look at these 2 bones here, the red one and the green one, so this is the malleus, and that's evolved from the articular bone of the jaw. So here's the articular bone in a reptilian jaw and in an avian jaw. You can see it when we look at the mammalian jaw, it's no longer there. And the green bone here, which is called the incus, that evolved from the quadrate bone of the jaw. Okay, so the quadrate bone is not marked out in these diagrams here, but if you look here, here's the quadrate, it's this kind of that, brown bone right here. When you get to the mammalian jaw over here, it's gone. So the articular and the quadrate bones from the reptilian jaw were actually repurposed, and the bones migrated up into the skull where they became incorporated into the inner ear. So that's another very significant difference between mammals and reptiles. And so we're looking for these differences, we're looking to see when they start appearing in the fossil record. And once we start seeing animals that have this, more dentary dominated jaw design, free-boned inner ear, and differentiated teeth, well then we know we're looking at a mammal. Okay, excuse me. I should point out, if I go back for just 1 second, our problem is, of course, is that we have so many transitional forms between reptiles and mammals that it actually makes it difficult to work out, once again, what the exact path that was taken was. Just like the transition between dinosaurs and birds. So many possible options, it makes it very, very difficult to work out which road evolution took. So just to give you some idea when it comes to what I'm talking about with differentiated teeth, let's have a look at these 2 skulls. So the skull at the top here is a crocodile, and the skull down here is a hadrosaur, an ornithopod dinosaur. So when you look at the crocodile teeth, yes, there is some variation in size, but the tooth design does not change. They're all like little needles, aren't they? In the case of the hadrosaur here, you can see once again, the teeth are very uniform in size, and you can see they're all exactly the same shape. So there's no differentiation between these teeth at all. Now let's compare that to a skull of a cynodont. So once again, these are these very mammal-like reptiles. What do we see? Well, to begin with, we can see incisors at the front. We can see canines. You can see canines up here at the top as well. And we can see a set of molars. So we can see these cynodont reptile/mammals clearly have differentiated teeth. So they clearly have molars, canines, and incisors. That is something that reptiles do not possess. Reptilian teeth are essentially just copies of every other tooth. The size varies, but essentially the style of the tooth does not change. So what are the other features that indicate that cynodonts were the ancestors of mammals? Okay, well obviously we've discussed free-boned inner ear, jaw design, and teeth. Anything else? Right, the first one is the tooth root. So cynodont teeth became double-rooted, like mammal teeth. Okay, so mammals have double-rooted teeth. There's 4 little pinnacles that stick out and attach your tooth into your jawbone. Now, this means that mammalian teeth are very difficult to pull out from the jaw, so they're very, very robust. But it also means that when the tooth essentially degrades, it's very difficult to replace because there's a lot of serious engineering required. So if we look back here at the crocodile teeth, we can see the teeth are just sitting essentially in a hole in the jaw. And so once this tooth here degrades, it just pops out and a new tooth will grow in its place. Same with the hadrosaurs here. Once a tooth degrades, it just falls out and a new tooth grows in its place. In the case of mammals, because we have this double-rooted tooth, and that's some pretty significant engineering, it makes it far more difficult for new teeth to grow and replace old teeth. So that's why we only really have 2 sets of teeth during our lifetime. But nevertheless, this double-rooted tooth is a good indicator of being a mammal. Next is, of course, the specialized teeth. We've already touched on this. The cynodonts have molars, canines, and incisors. Essentially, each one of those teeth perform a certain function. Now, you need to bear in mind that the number of incisors, canines, and molars that you have will vary depending on what species you are. So if you're an animal that's designed for catching prey, well, obviously you want canines, nice big canines so you can bite into your prey and hold them, and you need the incisors to be able to slice through the meat. But what you don't really need are lots of molars, because you're not really chewing the meat, you're just swallowing it in chunks. In contrast, if you're a cow, what you really want are lots and lots of molars, because you really have to pulp and chew the grass before you swallow it. So cows have relatively small canines. In fact, they've nearly lost them completely. They've changed them into kind of like molar-like teeth. And the cow's incisors are also not a significant proportion of their teeth. Most of the teeth in a cow's mouth are molars. So the number of each of these different types of teeth you have will vary, but nevertheless, all mammals have incisors, canines, and molars. What else? Sets of teeth. Well, as discussed, mammals will typically only have 2 sets of teeth during their lifetime. Reptiles have the capacity to constantly replace lost teeth. Any other differences? Grinding. The way that the mammalian jaw works, it means we not only can pulp our food by banging our teeth together, but it also means that when we chew, our teeth actually grind. They have a kind of slight circular motion. So essentially your lower teeth rub against your upper teeth in a kind of circular motion, and it helps to grind, to pulp the food trapped between the 2 teeth. Now, this is very, very important, because this pulping motion, this grinding motion, helps us to extract even more nutrients from the food. So if we go back to the hadrosaur, the hadrosaur we have here are the teeth. So a hadrosaur, when it chews, essentially it didn't have the capacity to grind its teeth. It could just bang its teeth together, so the bottom teeth bang into the upper teeth. And that essentially pulps the food, but it doesn't really pulp it particularly efficiently. So the hadrosaurs didn't actually get the maximum value out of the food they were eating. In contrast, a cynodont, the upper teeth, the lower teeth here, would actually grind against the lower teeth in a kind of circular motion as it was chewing, and that allows the cynodont to extract more nutrients from the food, and therefore that is more efficient. What else? Well, there's also something called the occipital condyle. So the occipital condyle is a bony lump that sits at the base of your skull, and it locks your skull into the first vertebrae of your spinal column. The first vertebrae is called the atlas. So in reptiles, the occipital condyle is a single lump. So you have a lump of bone at the back of the skull, and that locks into the first vertebrae of the spine. And in the case of reptiles, it's a single lump. In the case of mammals, however, the occipital condyle actually consists of 2 lumps. So there's two pieces of bone. In the case of the cynodont dinosaurs, we see that the occipital condyle for the cynodont dinosaurs is partially divided. So it's sitting between the single lump of the reptiles and the split lump of the mammals. So that's the kind of intermediate stage between the 2 end members. So if we actually look at this picture here, so this is the bottom of a human skull. You can actually see here's one lump here, and here is the other lump here, and both of these will lock into the first vertebrae of the spinal column. And so this is the occipital condyle in a mammal. In the case of a reptile, it would just be one single lump of bone. So that, once again, is a very obvious difference. So then we're coming on to the final 2 things that we notice. The next thing we notice is the palate. So we begin to see, as we go from reptiles through the therapsids into the cynodonts and then into the mammals proper, we see changes in the palate. So what's the palate? The palate is the roof of your mouth. So the primary palate sits directly behind the upper front teeth in your mouth. Behind that, you have what's referred to as the secondary palate. Now, the secondary palate is important because it separates your nasal cavity from your mouth. So what this means is because you have a big hard palate at the top, a big piece of bone at the top of your mouth that separates your nasal cavity from your mouth, it means that you can have food in your mouth, you can be chewing, and you can be breathing at the same time. Now that's important if you are a warm-blooded organism like a mammal, because we have very, very high oxygen requirements. Because we have such a high metabolism, because we're warm-blooded, it means we need to get lots and lots of oxygen into our bodies. So if we have to stop breathing to chew, then obviously that's bad, because, if you stop breathing for too long, you'll pass out. So in the case of reptiles, they do have a palate at the roof of their mouth, but it's not made of bone. It's made of essentially very flimsy cartilage, or it's just a layer of skin, a membrane of some kind. Now what this means, of course, is that if they have a lot of food in their mouth, it means the palate gets pushed up into the nasal cavity, and that will inhibit their ability to breathe. However, because they are cold-blooded and they have a slower metabolism, it means their oxygen requirements are a lot lower, and so they can live with that for a short period of time. So that's why having this larger secondary palate is very, very important, because it helps to allow warm-blooded animals like the mammals, warm-blooded organisms like the mammals, to be able to breathe whilst eating, which is essential. So I'm just going to nip to this diagram here. So here we go. So here you can see over time we have a change. So this is a modern dog here. This is a cynodont here. And you can see that steadily over time the secondary palate, which is marked out in green here, gets larger, eventually fuses. And then you can see by the time we're at the essentially a modern dog, we can see the secondary palate's very, very large. And then we also have essentially the tertiary palate here. We can also see that this also gets steadily larger as we progress. So this is helping to separate essentially the mouth from the nasal cavity directly above. So that's a good indicator that the organism is becoming more and more mammalian. As this secondary palate gets larger and larger, that's a good indicator it's becoming more and more mammalian. Another thing you'll notice, by the way, is that if you look here, we have some bones. They're marked out in yellow and red. The yellow bone is the red bone is very, very important because that's the quadrate bone. And we can notice that as we go along, the quadrate bone gets smaller and smaller, and then eventually by the time we're at the dog, it's disappeared because the quadrate has disappeared into, where are we? There it is, the inner ear, where it's become the incus. So we can also see from that the progression of those skulls there, the loss of the quadrate bone and its repositioning within the inner ear of the mammals. So if we go back, we now have the final point that we note. So the final observation is something a bit more general. So as previously discussed, we have these two bones in the reptile jaw that evolved to become part of the mammalian ear. So when we look at the development of embryos, we can begin to see some similarities between mammals and reptiles. So in 1837, a gentleman called Carl Reichardt discovered that mammal embryos have a quadrate and articulate bone in their jaw when they are initially growing in the womb. As the embryo develops and becomes more mature, those two bones will then move from the jaw up into the skull, where they become incorporated into the inner ear. So the fact that when we're in the womb, we initially start with a quadrate and articular bone in our jaw strongly suggests that we are actually related to the reptiles. And then slowly over time, these two bones migrate into the skull and they become part of the inner ear. So by looking at the embryos and embryonic development, it gives us a hint that we are related to reptiles. So it's pretty obvious that mammals are descended from reptiles, and more accurately the cynodonts, and we can trace this lineage, of the reptiles giving rise to the Pachycephalosaurs giving rise to the Therapsids giving rise to the cynodonts, and the cynodonts developing into mammals proper. Okay, so what about Mesozoic mammals? So Mesozoic mammals were typically small. and they were normally about the size of mice and rats, so they didn't really exceed about 15 centimeters in length. So that's not really surprising. The dinosaurs were in complete control. They were the apex predators. They're in charge of everything. So mammals didn't really have the opportunity to grow into larger body forms because they were being outcompeted by the reptiles. So there are two exceptions to this relatively small body design, and they're both from China. The first example is an unnamed Middle Jurassic aquatic mammal which measured about 50 centimeters, so half a meter in length, and it has the oldest known fur. So that was pretty big. Now in this case, as we can see, it's aquatic, so that means it's living in an environment where the vast majority of reptiles don't live. So it's made its own little environmental niche. And because it's got that little environmental niche, that means it has control over the food supply, and so it can grow to larger sizes. So it's not really competing with other animals. So then we have another Mesozoic mammal. This is, excuse my terrible pronunciation, Reptinomammus giganticus. And this is from the early Cretaceous, and it was about 1 meter long. It was a carnivore, and it weighed between about 12 and 14 kilograms. And you can see a picture of it over here. From what we can tell, it was, kind of a hybrid between a rat and, any one of a number of animals, maybe a badger, a possum, something like that, in its general design. And an example of this particular dinosaur was actually found to have a juvenile dinosaur in its stomach. So this particular mammal actually fed on young dinosaurs. So it should be remembered that these very primitive mammals still retain some reptilian features, and the features that we consider definitive for a mammal were still developing during the Mesozoic through the process of mosaic evolution. So don't just think we went from cynodonts straight to modern mammals in one quick step. We didn't. It was a gradual process, and it's this all going on through the Mesozoic. So here we go. So actually here is here's the skeleton itself. So just for scale, this gives you some idea of the Reptinomammus giganticus compared to a modern day possum. So you can see it was quite large, about 1 meter or so in length. And this is actually the skeleton here. So you've got the forelimbs here, spinal column, rib cage, pelvis, and you can see this is the stomach contents here. And when we zoom into the stomach contents, we can see that it consists of dinosaur phalanges marked out here in green, the hind limb of a dinosaur marked out here in red, dinosaur teeth marked out down here in purple, and forelimb bones from a dinosaur marked out here in blue. So amongst some of the stuff it was eating small or juvenile dinosaurs. So we know that mammals were present by the late Triassic, and they diverged into two distinct groups. The first group is the monotremes. So that's a group of egg-laying mammals, and that includes animals like the spiny anteater and the platypus. And this group diverged sometime around the Middle Jurassic. So they went off along their own branch sometime around the Middle Jurassic. So then we have the second group, which are the therians, and they give birth to live young. And essentially that's all other mammals, and this group, the therians, is split into the marsupials, or the pouched mammals, that's kangaroos, koalas and wombats, and the placental mammals, that's the group that includes rodents, humans, bears, whales, etc. So we are uncertain when divergence of the monotremes occurred. However, as we discussed, we have fossils in the 160 million year old Jarama, let's try that again, of a 160-year-old animal called Dramia. And that indicates the divergence of marsupials and placental mammals had occurred by the Middle Jurassic. So we know the monotremes probably go off on one branch sometime around the Middle Jurassic, and we know that relatively soon after the monotremes go off along their own branch, so then we have the therians, and then not long after that, the therians then split off, separate to give the marsupials and the placental mammals. So the divergence of the mammals appears to have occurred in the Middle Jurassic. So we have fossils of placental mammals that indicate the line was well established by the early Cretaceous. So the separation was very noticeable by the early Cretaceous. So what about Mesozoic paleogeography? Paleobiogeography, sorry. So the construction and fragmentation of Pangaea had significant effects on the habitats that formed and therefore the distribution of certain animals during the Mesozoic. So for much of the Mesozoic, the global climate was relatively equitable, and the transition from the equator to the higher latitudes was not that strong, so the temperatures at the high latitudes were actually surprisingly warm. So, although there was some variation caused by regional factors, things like mountain ranges which would affect how the air in the atmosphere moved, on the whole, the climate was relatively stable, relatively homogeneous. So the equitable climate allowed plants and animals to occupy more extensive geographical ranges, particularly in coastal areas where there was lots of rain. So just to give you some idea, during the Triassic, there were the Triassic period was tropical, with mild temperatures extending 50 degrees north and south of the equator. So 50 degrees north or south of the equator essentially puts you in the, give or take a little bit, around the northern states of the US, say about South Dakota, give or take a little bit. So imagine, mild, semi-tropical conditions extending all the way up to South Dakota. So as Pangaea was still together, we see dinosaurs and plants that have essentially near global distributions. Because the climate is so homogeneous, it means these dinosaurs can move around, they can go from one place to another, safe in the knowledge that the climate's not going to be significantly different, therefore they'll be able to find the same plants, the same food, etc. So this mild climate continued into the Jurassic, although by this point Pangaea was breaking up, with Laurasia rifting away from Gondwana. However, we see temperatures were so pleasant that we have tropical ferns growing as high as 63 degrees north of the equator. Just to give you some idea, 60 degrees north of the equator is the southern tip of Greenland. So during the Jurassic, temperatures were so nice, we had essentially tropical plants growing at latitudes equivalent to the southern tip of modern-day Greenland. That shows you how nice and warm it was at very, very high latitudes. So by the late Jurassic, Eurasia, so that's North America, Europe and Asia, had begun to separate from North America. South America was also beginning to rift away from Africa. Now, to be clear, the separation of Eurasia from North America took a very, very long period of time. Okay, didn't actually occur until the very, very, very late Cretaceous, very early Cenozoic. So that wasn't a slow process. But the disintegration of Gondwana, that's South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Madagascar. Hold on, let's try that one again. I think I missed one. So South America, Africa, India, Australia, Antarctica, Madagascar. Yeah, okay. No, I did get them all. My mistake. Apologies there. So Gondwana was falling apart during the Jurassic and into the Cretaceous, and this begins to affect global circulation, the global circulation of seawater, as we've discussed, and that starts to have an effect on the climate. This separation of the northern hemisphere continents from the southern hemisphere continents also explains why some dinosaurs like Stegosaurus, the Pachycephalosaurs, the Ankylosaurs are limited exclusively to the northern continents, and why some dinosaurs are become limited exclusively to the southern continents, because those two land masses are now separated by a large body of water. So by the Cretaceous, South America, Africa, India, North America were all discrete continents. I should point out, in the case of North America, it was the extremely late Cretaceous. Eurasia, so that's Europe and Asia, stayed together, still together now. And towards the end of the Cretaceous, Australia was still joined to Antarctica. It was just completing its rift to separate itself from Antarctica right at the end of the Cretaceous. So the Cretaceous marks a period where we get these strongly defined climatic zones developing, and this is due to the changes in ocean circulation caused by the disruption of ocean circulations by the continents separating and essentially getting in the way and the continents get in the way, it causes ocean circulation patterns to change. So during the Cretaceous, we get some of the largest variation in fauna and flora as localized evolution begins to take place, because we begin to get areas of the globe that start to get a lot colder in winter, have much wetter, grayer summers, and so all of a sudden tropical plants cannot exist in those environments, and so plants begin to specialize to be able to live under the new conditions. So what we begin to see is we get isolated populations produce several interesting trends during the Cretaceous. So we see that the marsupial dinosaurs, the pouched mammals, arrive in Australia via Antarctica, but very few placental mammals actually make it. So the marsupials, the pouched mammals, are the dominant type of mammal in Australia. What happens is Australia separates from Antarctica before the placental mammals have the opportunity to make it across in large numbers. And so, as I say, the mammalian population of Australia is dominated by marsupials. So the middle to late Cretaceous climate of South America actually remained perfect for the large, long-necked sauropod dinosaurs. And so the sauropod dinosaurs actually flourished during the Cretaceous in South America. Everywhere else, on the other hand, because the climate was changing, they were actually going extinct, and they were dominantly replaced by the hadrosaur dinosaurs. So that was a pretty significant difference. In the case of South America and the sauropods, conditions were so good that they steadily evolved over time to give us the massive Titanosauria, the biggest of all the sauropod dinosaurs. And that increase in size was primarily driven, excuse the snorting from my dog there if you heard it, the increase in size of the Titanosauria was driven primarily by predation. So what happened was you had these really big sauropod dinosaurs in South America. The conditions were great. What happened is the predators started growing larger so they could eat the sauropods. So the sauropods grew larger so the predators couldn't eat them. So that means the predators then have to grow larger, and so on and so on and so on. And an arms race begins. And so we see during the Jurassic and into the Cretaceous, we see the sauropod dinosaurs in South America getting really, really large. And we also see a matching increase in the size of the theropod dinosaurs in South America, because obviously they're getting bigger to eat the sauropod dinosaurs. We've also got some relatively recent evidence that suggests that some members of the Titanosauria actually managed to make it to Australia via Antarctica, although that evidence is still a little bit sketchy. In terms of South America and its mammalian population, South America did not receive many mammals, so once the dinosaurs were gone, birds became the apex predators. And this led to the evolution of 3-meter high, massive flightless birds called terrorbirds, and terrorbirds quickly died out as carnivorous mammals moved into South America from North America about 2.5 million years ago. So I might have already touched on this, but when it comes to it, the loss of the dinosaurs actually left a niche open that was filled very rapidly, not by the mammals, but by the birds. So at the start of the Cenozoic, actually the birds became the apex species, and then over time they were outcompeted by the mammals. Okay, so what happens at the end of the Cretaceous? Well, we know what's going to happen. There's going to be a really big impact. So how do we know that happens? Well, okay, so the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, which is sometimes referred to as the KT boundary, extinction event was not only devastating for the dinosaurs and the pterosaurs, but also it did a lot of damage to marine invertebrates, particularly ammonites and rudist bivalves. You remember the rudist bivalves were the organisms that made up the reefs during the Mesozoic, especially during the Cretaceous. And we also see a lot of damage being done to the planktonic organisms in the oceans, essentially the photosynthesizing organisms in the oceans, your diatoms, dinoflagellates, and coccolithophores. So the reason for this mass extinction was debated for some time. So for a while it was thought that the Deccan Traps eruptions in India could have been the result. So the Deccan Traps is essentially a flood basalt eruption in India, and that would have put huge quantities of greenhouse gases and chlorine and fluorine and other bad stuff into the atmosphere, and some people believed that these huge eruptions were sufficient to cause the food chain to collapse on a global scale, and then that would have led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. Now, we don't think that's the case. We do think the Deccan traps had some effect, but we don't think it was the big effect. Some people also suggested that the breakup of the continents and the changes in ocean circulation and the changes in weather patterns would also have had a serious effect on the dinosaurs and therefore led to their extinction. And yes, chances are that did have quite a serious effect on the dinosaurs, but on its own it would not have been sufficient to actually kill off the dinosaurs. So, there was a bit of a problem. We didn't have any kind of mechanism that could really kill off, an entire family of organisms like the dinosaurs, like the pterosaurs, in one go. However, in 1980, a 2.5 centimeter thick layer of clay at the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary was analysed. So this actually is the area itself. So a couple of physicists actually were taking samples of limestone. This is a sequence of limestones here in the mountains in Italy. And they're taking measurements of a sequence of limestones because they were trying to find a new dating technique to date sedimentary rocks. Now, as they're working their way along, in the middle of this limestone sequence, there is a single layer of clay. And so, they decided to take a sample of the layer of clay and they decided to test that as well. Now, it just so happened that the test they were using was looking at platinum group elements. So those are elements like platinum, palladium, iridium, ruthenium, osmium, etc. Okay? Platinum is the one you guys are probably most familiar with. Now, these elements are extremely rare in the Earth's crust because the platinum group element budget for the Earth is mostly sequestered in the Earth's core because they're very, very sidrophile elements. They like to form bonds with iron. So when the Earth was a big ball of magma and it began to form these iron droplets that eventually went to form the core, when those iron droplets formed, they began to vacuum up all the platinum group elements in the magma ocean very, very efficiently. And then those big drops of essentially molten metal began to sink to the center of the Earth where they formed the Earth's core, and they took the platinum group elements with them. And so this means that the Earth's mantle and the Earth's crust is very platinum group element poor. We do not have much platinum, palladium, iridium, osmium in the Earth's crust, which is why they're so expensive, because they're relatively rare metals. Now, as I said, one of these elements is the element iridium. When they tested the limestones, they found, they found practically no iridium, and then all of a sudden they hit this clay layer, and they discovered it was absolutely stuffed with iridium, full of the stuff. And that was a pretty big shock. So, just to be clear, if you go anywhere in the world and you look at this Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary, you can actually see there is a layer of clay that marks it out. You can see it here as this white layer. In some areas, directly above this boundary, there is actually a black layer, and we'll discuss that in a second. So, as we've already discussed, iridium is a platinum group element, and the vast majority of the Earth's platinum group elements are locked in the Earth's core, where we can't get to them, and so that means the Earth's crust is very, very platinum group element poor. Just to give you some idea, the average concentration of iridium in the Earth's crust is 500 parts per trillion. So for every 1 trillion atoms you take of material from the Earth's crust, you will only have 500 atoms of iridium in there. That is a very low concentration. So the question becomes, how do we get why do we have these high quantities of iridium? So look at this graph down here. This shows you the sequence of data from the limestones. You can see that, this is parts per billion here. We can see, there's maybe, 0.25, maybe 0.5 parts per billion iridium in these limestones. And then all of a sudden we hit the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary and bang! All of a sudden the concentration of iridium shoots up to 3.5 parts per billion. That's a very significant increase from 500 parts per trillion. So clearly there are significant quantities of iridium in this clay layer. So the one question is well, where do we find, high quantities of iridium? Well, we do find high quantities of iridium associated with certain types of mineral deposit, where we mine things like platinum and palladium, but they are typically associated with very special types of minerals. And we do not see those minerals in this clay layer. So we don't think the iridium in this clay layer is anything to do with a kind of mineralizing process. So then we have to think about, well, where else could this iridium have come from? And the only other place where we have large quantities of iridium is in asteroids. It's in meteorites, the things in the asteroid belt. So those represent undifferentiated planetary material. So essentially an asteroid is a tiny planet that failed. It wanted to be a big planet like the Earth, but it didn't grow fast enough, so it never made it. So because it didn't grow large enough, it never melted and it never differentiated, so it never formed a core. And that means all the platinum group elements that make up the asteroids are evenly distributed throughout the whole asteroid. So this means that asteroids are absolutely stuffed with platinum group elements all over the place. So if an asteroid, or at least a bit of an asteroid, hits the Earth, it's going to bring lots of platinum group elements with it. So once we have that basic theory, well then all of a sudden a few things begin to make sense. So number one, once you think, right, it could be an asteroid, well then all of a sudden the iridium anomaly begins to make sense. Once we understand that, then we can begin to look at the iridium isotopes. So the isotopes of iridium that we find in this clay layer are not the isotopes of iridium we expect to find in Earth. So if we take a sample of material from Earth and measure the iridium isotopes in it, it gives us a distinct value, essentially a distinct set of ratios for the iridium isotopes, and those ratios are completely different to the iridium isotope ratios we find in the clay layer. So that tells us the iridium in the clay layer has to have come from somewhere else, most likely not on Earth. Another good piece of evidence to suggest it's related to an asteroid impact. The next piece of evidence that we find is that within these clay layers we find lots and lots of pieces of something called shocked quartz. And here's a piece of shocked quartz over here. So shocked quartz is quartz that has lots and lots of little lines in it. And these lines are the result of the pressure wave from the impact passing through the rock, actually causing the crystal lattice of the quartz crystal to warp. And so as it begins to warp, it forms these parallel lines within the crystal, and this crystal is referred to as a shocked crystal of quartz. And shocked crystals of quartz can only form in one of two ways. The first way is due to they can only form during high energy events. So the only way to form them is either a meteorite impact or a nuclear explosion. So those are the two ways you can essentially form shocked quartz. And so the fact that we have all this shocked quartz within the clay layer clearly suggests there was a big impact. What else do we have? Well, the next piece of evidence we have is the soot layer, which is this dark layer on top here. So the soot layer sits directly above the clay layer, and it's made up of lots and lots of burnt organic material. And so it would seem that what we have is a situation where we have lots and lots of very large, very widespread fires. So we have to think to ourselves, well, what could set fire to large areas of the globe at exactly the same time? And so the most likely explanation is a meteorite impact. So a meteorite comes slamming into the Earth. It throws lots of bits of hot rock and molten rock into the atmosphere. They go flying over large distances, and they land. They set fire to the vegetation, and you end up with huge forest fires. There's also some modelling that suggests that maybe pieces of the asteroid broke off as it was falling to Earth, and these pieces, as they broke off, they fell to Earth and started fires all over the place as well. So that might help to explain where this soot layer comes from. The fact this soot layer is seen, at the KT boundary at a number of locations suggests that these fires were very, very widespread. They weren't localized. They were on a continent to multiple continent scale. And then finally, we have the tsunami deposits. So at the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, at some locations, they are coastal locations, we have huge deposits of tsunami material. So it would suggest that those coastlines were hit by massive waves right at the end of the Cretaceous. And so, these tsunami deposits are larger than the types of tsunami deposits we expect to get at convergent plate boundaries. So something big had to have happened to form them. And the most likely explanation is an asteroid went and landed in the ocean, producing a giant wave which produces significant quantities of tsunami deposits. Makes sense, doesn't it? So, okay, once we have that evidence and once it begins to make sense, all of a sudden the idea that the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction was caused by an asteroid begins to become relatively straightforward. So then we need to work out, well, where did this happen? Well, once we do the calculations, we begin to calculate the impact that struck the Earth was estimated to have been about 10 kilometers in diameter, and it would have produced a crater around 180 kilometers in diameter and about 20 kilometers deep. So you don't need something very big to produce a very big hole in the ground. So the impact itself would have displaced somewhere in the region of 200,000 cubic kilometers of rock and sediment. So some of that material would be instantly vaporized, and some of that material would have been thrown high into the atmosphere in the form of dust. And obviously mixed in with that dust, you would have had pieces of the asteroid. So this dust, which contains the piece of the asteroid, goes flying up into the atmosphere. It's called ejecta, so it gets ejected into the atmosphere. It goes flying up into the atmosphere, and the ejecta settles out, rains out onto the ground, where it forms a layer of clay. And the impact is so big, the ejecta gets thrown into the high atmosphere, and it gets distributed across the entire globe. And so this is why you can find this clay layer at the KT boundary everywhere. So eventually the ejecta, of course, goes to form the clay layer. So the final question is well, where is the impact crater? And we got lucky. So some geologists were doing an oil survey in the Gulf of Mexico, and while they were doing that oil survey, they came across some geophysical signals. They were doing geophysics work. They came across some signals that suggested that around the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, something strange was going on with the rocks on the seafloor. So eventually, the feature they discovered was approximately circular, and it was eventually enough money was found to drill it. And so when they drilled into it, they found that it was an impact crater. And when they dated the rocks inside that impact crater, they found they dated to between 65 and 66 million years ago, which puts the impact crater right at the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. And the impact crater in question, which is called the Chicxulub impact crater, is exactly the right size for the kind of destruction that we would expect at the end of the Cretaceous from a very large meteorite impact. So that's where impact crater was located. So what did the impact actually do? Just to give you some idea, by the way, here's dry lands. This is the Yucatan Peninsula down here. Here's the Gulf of Mexico here. And this is the size of the impact crater itself. Okay. So when we actually look at it, if you're on land, you actually see you've got all these white dots here. They represent canyons. And what's happened is the destruction, essentially the faulting of the rock caused by the impact crater encourages the formation of these underground caves, these caverns, underground on land. And so if you ever go to this area of Mexico around the Yucatan Peninsula, you can actually go into these caves, and the cave systems are quite spectacular. But the cave systems themselves are only there because of essentially the faulting of the rock produced by the produced by the Chicxulub impact. So that gives you some idea of what's going on. You can actually see, by the way, inside the impact crater you get these concentric circles. These are large concentric faults that form within impact craters when the impact occurs, and that's very, very consistent with an impact crater. So what do we know? Well, we know the impact has to have occurred in a coastal region, hence the tsunamis. We know that a massive quantity of ejecta, so that's superheated dust, ash and steam, will have entered the atmosphere. Obviously some of that fell out, producing the clay layer, but a lot of it will have stayed in the atmosphere, and it will have essentially blocked the sun from making it to the surface of the Earth. And this blocking of the sun will have lasted for several months, and that would have impacted organisms that photosynthesized, because obviously if you need photosynthesis to survive, well, that's a bit of a problem. If there's no sunlight making it to the surface, you're in trouble. So, that would have done significant damage to the food chain, because obviously plants will have died, photosynthesizing algae will have died, the food chains will have collapsed, and obviously animals will have died out. Also at the same time, once again, if no sun is making it to the surface of the Earth, global temperatures are going to plummet. By the way, a quick news flash. Once again, a relatively recent study has suggested that the nuclear winter that followed the impact, which was initially thought to only be several months, could actually have been in excess of 100 years. So it would have been quite a big event. Now you're thinking, hold on, how did the plants actually manage to survive if the event was that long? Well, there are some types of photosynthesizing algae that have the capacity to put themselves into a state of hibernation for very long periods of time. So they could have done that if conditions went against them. And plant seeds are extremely robust. They can sit around for very, very long periods of time, waiting for conditions to become right, at which point they will germinate and the plants will grow. So, plants do have the capacity to survive for very, very long periods of time without sun, providing they can obviously, take the right precautions, either put themselves into hibernation or essentially have produced seeds that can just sit there for long periods of time and just wait until conditions become advantageous again. So, also we have this dust being thrown into the atmosphere. We have rapid global temperature decreases. We have huge wildfires, which will have put more dust into the atmosphere. Obviously, the wildfires will have destroyed the forest ecosystem as well. And we also have the problem that the vaporized rock will have put sulfur and nitrogen compounds into the atmosphere in very, very large quantities. They will have formed sulfuric and nitric acid when they combine with water. And this acid will have fallen out of the sky in the form of acid rain. And that will have reduced soil pH, damaging plants, and it could have reduced ocean pH, damaging life in the oceans, and so that would also have led to the collapse of the food chain. So you can quite clearly see this impact will have done significant quantities of damage to the global food chain, and so it becomes rather obvious, rather easy to explain why there would be a mass extinction. So was the impact the cause of the Cretaceous-Tertiary mass extinction? The answer is yes, and then again no. So the question becomes, how come the dinosaurs died out, but not the crocodiles, or the turtles, or the mammals? There have to have been other factors involved. So the data indicates that the dinosaurs, flying reptiles, marine reptile populations in the late Cretaceous were already suffering. Okay? They were either in decline, or they were being squished into smaller and smaller areas as the global climate changed. So they were under pressure. And this change likely occurred in response to changes in global and regional climates, producing changes in the terrestrial ecosystem and reducing ocean temperatures. So conditions were going against the dinosaurs, the flying reptiles, the marine reptiles. So we also see the warm, shallow seas of the Zuni transgression begin to retreat, and this essentially reduces the habitats for animals like ammonites and bivalves and marine reptiles, which have been living in these nice, shallow, warm seas, which are full of life, full of stuff to eat, and then all of a sudden these warm, shallow seas begin to disappear, and the food source is gone. And so we begin to see the numbers of ammonites, rudists, and marine reptiles collapsing. And obviously we have the aforementioned Deccan Traps eruption, and that will have put enormous amounts of hydrogen sulfide into the atmosphere. Hydrogen sulfide mixes with water to produce sulfuric acid, and this will produce acid rain, which once again will fall into the soil, damaging plants, or fall into the oceans, changing the ocean pH, which will damage photosynthesizing blue-green algae. Once again, that can lead to the collapse of the food chain, or at least damages the food chain. And we also have the problem that very large volcanic eruptions will also put large quantities of chlorine and fluorine into the atmosphere. They will react with ozone in the upper atmosphere, and that will degrade the ozone layer, meaning more ultraviolet radiation will make it to the surface of the Earth. And so that obviously would lead to higher rates of diseases like cancer. So, there's the possibility that, increased ultraviolet exposure could possibly have also hurt populations of especially land-dwelling animals during that time period. And then finally, on top of all that, then this meteorite comes flying in, huge impact, nuclear winter. The ecosystems on a global scale just collapse, and that leads to a mass extinction. So essentially this meteorite impact was literally the final nail in the coffin, and it just pushed the dinosaurs and the ammonites and the rudists and the flying reptiles and the marine reptiles over the edge, and there was no way those populations could possibly recover. Okay, everybody. Now, I just realised I went for about 40 minutes without taking a break, for which I do apologise. I got a bit carried away there. Sorry. So don't forget, the code word for this presentation is Triceratops. I repeat, Triceratops. So thank you for sticking with me. Take care and keep an eye out for the next presentation.